Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for giving us some time out of your day. I am Corey Saylor, CoreySaylor, and we're going to talk about the findings in this new report. So let's just look at the top line. We've been tracking total complaints coming into CAIR since 1995, and every year that we've done this report, there has been a rise in incidences, sometimes more so than others. For instance, after Donald Trump announced his campaign plan to ban Muslims from entering this country, we had a very steep rise in the number of complaints. But what we're seeing now is a 23% drop in complaints that we had in 2022 compared to 2021. Now that's really encouraging, but we're not quite ready to say it's a trend yet for a couple of reasons. One, it's one data point. It's only 1 year. Two, when we watch hate in this country, it is certainly focused on other communities at this point. So if you look at Asian Americans, if you look at anti-Semitism, both of them continue to spiral out of control. So one good data point is not a great story, but it is encouraging, and I think we should feel some optimism. So let's dive into what we got a little bit. We had 5,156 total complaints in 2022. Now that is a 23% drop, but what we do when those complaints come in is we categorize them. So we get a sense of the trends that are going on with the complaints that are coming into the organization. And asylum and immigration was the highest complaint category that we got. Not really unshocking given the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. We're still seeing residue from that. Workplace discrimination was another top category, incarceratory rights, and as Edward already mentioned, issues related to schools. We'll dive in a little bit to some nuance in the data in a second, but to give you a sense, I described immigration and asylum a little bit. Incarceratory rights often is focused on inmates having access to food during Ramadan. And not having to make a choice between starving or exercising their faith. And we've had cases like that this year during this Ramadan. So here's some of that nuance that we promised. Before I dive into it, it's worth understanding we're, like any good organization, always tweaking our categories because we're trying to figure out how best to understand the types of complaints that are coming into us. So what we did for 2022 is we took a category, law enforcement and government overreach, and split it into 3 separate categories. Now you can add up those 3 categories and you still get an apples to apples comparison, which is how we're able to make the conclusion I'm about to make. But what we saw when you compare the 2022 data to 2021 was an overall 38% drop in cases that are government driven. It kind of makes sense to us. Trump came into office promising to ban Muslims from entering this country. That was one of the first things that he enacted when he got into office. And you will also remember that he said he thinks Islam hates us. So when you have that kind of administration and it has the resources of a government, you're going to expect government cases to shoot upward wildly. That's what we expected. There's a new face in the White House at this point. And so we think part of the reduction has to do with an administration with a less Islamophobic attitude. The other thing that we saw is January 6th. For many years, anti-government and white supremacist organizations had a form of political cover granted to them, particularly by the Republican Party. And we call your attention back to 2009, when a DHS analyst concluded that white supremacists were trying to recruit people from the US military, and his report was destroyed by Republicans. They were forced to recall, DHS was forced to recall the report. The man in question who authored the report eventually left the Department of Homeland Security, and his department was also reduced in size. By a couple of years later, the Washington Post was reporting that the Department of Homeland Security had one analyst focused on threats to this country that were not alleged to be from Muslim sources. So you have this giant movement that has one analyst at the Department of Homeland Security. Looking into it, that has changed post-January 6th. So So we see that reduction in government-driven cases as being a good thing. The side that causes us tremendous concern would be school incidents. So just like that previous category, it got split. This, in 2022, we're looking at bullying. We're also looking at education discrimination. Bullying, I think, is self-explanatory. Education discrimination, these are things like Islamophobic classroom materials. These are things like students being denied religious holidays. And what we saw there was a 63% overall increase in cases. And obviously that is massively troubling. If I can just describe one incident to you, we have a case in Maryland where a 9th grader was allegedly locked in a bathroom by a school staffer, where the young lady was then assaulted by several of her classmates, one of whom tried to remove her headscarf and choke her with it. The school is reportedly let the staffer go, but that student now faces years of recovering from that incident. So these are, when we talk about school incidents, we're not talking about microaggressions. We're talking about, this is a real and serious threat to the physical person of this student. It is something that our organization will be focusing on going forward. We just wanted to quickly show you the different buckets that we have, the categories. If I can quickly just describe to you, because as we're giving you these numbers, we don't want to get lost in the background, the real human experience that we're talking about. So behind these categories, an anti-mosque incident. In Rochester, New York, a voice message was left on the phone of Islamic Center of Rochester. I am coming to your office with friends. We all have shotguns. The thing that I wanted to point out with this, they were able to catch the gentleman who was allegedly behind that phone call. Mosques get these kind of calls all the time, and they are underreported because so often the staff there is just like, and delete it and don't think through that they've just had a hate crime or a hate incident focused on them. So we're often talking to mosques, please just make sure you report these things to us, because we want to tell an accurate story and not an underreported one. And unfortunately, so many people in our community have been desensitized to the types of abuse they can face as they go about their daily lives. They're just not reporting it anymore. As another example of an incident in Castle Rock, Minnesota, a community was trying to open a cemetery. That was a years-long ordeal for them that involved their property being vandalized twice and a lawsuit, but that was $200,000 worth of damage done to the property, including live wires being cut and left open, possibly to injure somebody when they came to visit the site. So these are the human experience behind those numbers. So while we report, great, numbers are dropping, they're still human beings, they're still being impacted, and they deserve the protection of organizations like CAIR and partner organizations in the civil rights space. So that's the top lines of the report. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to my colleague Amar Ansari, who will talk about some of the recommendations we have for policymakers and people in the public. Thank you.